It started like any other night, but it wasn't just another night. A teenage girl on her way home from church stopped by two officers who claimed it was a routine check. But what if it wasn't? What if it was a setup from the start? They thought they were stopping just another kid, but they had no idea who she was. No idea her father was the one man who could bring their whole operation crashing down. What happens next is a story of betrayal, corruption, and a fight for justice that reaches all the way to the top. And trust me, you won't believe how it ends until we get there together. Let us know down in the comments what time you're listening and where you're tuning in from. We'd love to hear your voice in this conversation. Now, settle in, because this is one you won't forget. They say the most dangerous battles are the ones you never see coming. That's exactly how it started for Calvin Price, a man who had faced war zones across the world, only to come home and face the one battle he never expected. This wasn't Afghanistan. This wasn't Iraq. This was Chesapeake, Virginia. And the target wasn't him. It was his daughter. It was a quiet Sunday night. You know, one of those nights where the world feels just a little bit softer. Calvin had finished cleaning up after dinner. His daughter, Lauren, had left a little earlier for choir rehearsal at their church, just a few blocks away. 17 years old, honor student, and the kind of kid every parent dreams about. Straight A's never gave him trouble. She had dreams bigger than this small suburban neighborhood college, law school, becoming a civil rights attorney. She was everything to him. Ever since her mother passed away from breast cancer 2 years earlier, Lauren had become Calvin's whole world. Every morning they had breakfast together. Every evening they caught up on her plans. They had survived loss together. And just when it seemed like life was finally settling down, the unthinkable happened. Lauren called like she always did when she left the church. "On my way home, Daddy," she had said, her voice as bright as ever. Calvin told her to take her time, reminded her to keep her phone on speaker and both hands on the wheel, like he'd taught her 100 times before. She laughed, promising she'd be home in 10 minutes. But 10 minutes never came. About 15 minutes later, Calvin's phone rang again. But this time, it wasn't Lauren. It was a neighbor. "Calvin, you need to come to Oak Ridge Parkway. There's been an accident. It's Lauren." His heart stopped. Calvin didn't remember grabbing his keys. He didn't remember getting in his truck. All he remembered was the way his hands trembled on the steering wheel as he drove toward flashing lights in the distance. Police cruisers, yellow tape, and a small silver sedan. He recognized immediately Lauren's car. Time slowed when he saw her, his baby girl, face down on the cold asphalt, blood pooling around her cheerleading uniform. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. But his training kicked in before his emotions could swallow him whole. Calvin ran to her, dropped to his knees, and turned her gently onto her back. She was still breathing, barely. 3 gunshot wounds, one in the shoulder, one in the side, one dangerously close to her heart. "Lauren, baby, stay with me." His voice cracked as he pressed his hands to her wounds, trying to slow the bleeding. She struggled to speak, her lips trembling. I just reached for my phone. "Daddy," those words burned themselves into Calvin's soul. He looked up at the officers standing nearby, 2 of them, both in plain clothes. They weren't even trying to help her. They were standing there, whispering. One of them was shaking. The other kept looking down at something on the ground. Calvin followed their gaze, and that's when he saw Ithis military ID lying in the dirt next to Lauren's purse. And just like that, their faces changed. Fear, recognition, panic. One of them leaned toward the other and whispered something Calvin would never forget. "We need to make this go away. Call the chief." Make it go away? They had just shot his daughter, and now they were already planning a cover-up? Calvin's blood boiled. Every instinct in him screamed to make them pay. But he knew. He knew that if he lost control right there, they'd turn it around on him. So he stayed by his daughter's side, whispering to her, begging her to hold on as paramedics finally arrived. As they loaded Lauren into the ambulance, Calvin stood frozen. He watched as the officers slipped away from the scene, already on their phones, already spreading their lies. One of the neighbors approached him, tears in her eyes. "I filmed it," she whispered. "I filmed everything, but they took my phone." It was already starting. Calvin followed the ambulance to Chesapeake General. His mind raced the entire way. Who were those officers? Why did they recognize his name? Why was Lauren really stopped? And why, in God's name, did they shoot a 17-year-old girl for reaching for her phone? He paced the waiting room for hours. Every time a nurse walked by, his heart jumped into his throat. He had faced enemy fire, car bombs, and ambushes in foreign countries, but nothing compared to the fear he felt right now. Finally, a doctor emerged, face grim. "Mr. Price, your daughter is critical, but she's alive. One of the bullets missed her heart by less than an inch. She's stable for now, but we need to operate. There's a risk, the bullet near her spine. We don't know if she'll be able to walk." The words hit him like a freight train. Calvin nodded stiffly, thanking the doctor. But as soon as the man walked away, Calvin felt something else settle over him, something colder. He wasn't just a father anymore. He was a soldier again. And this was a war. Lauren wasn't the first. Calvin knew that in his gut. But if these men thought they could destroy his family and walk away clean, they had picked the wrong man. He had fought for his country. He had bled for justice. And now, justice had a new mission. His daughter, and no Juanino badge, no system, no corrupt official was going to stop him. Because they didn't just shoot a black man's daughter, they shot the daughter of a man trained to never lose. And Calvin Price was just getting started. The thing about corruption is, it doesn't waste time. While most people sleep, while families gather around their dinner tables, while you sit there thinking the system works the way it should, corruption is already 2 steps ahead. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the spin machine had already kicked into full gear. Local news anchors stood in front of the hospital, feeding the city a headline that made Calvin's stomach turn. Teen suspect shot by police after threatening behavior during traffic stop. Threatening? Lauren? The same girl who never even raised her voice at home? They were twisting the story. Fast. Reporters read from their scripts, parroting police statements that Lauren had made suspicious movements, that officers had feared for their safety. They even claimed she had a Wapona box cutter, they said. One anchor held up a photo of it like it was proof. What they didn't say was that Lauren was unarmed. What they didn't show was the glittery pink phone case that had fallen from her hand onto the pavement. And what they definitely didn't mention was that the 2 officers involved had a long, dirty history. But Calvin didn't know that part yet. Not yet. He sat in the hospital, staring at the floor, fists clenched so tight his knuckles were white. Nurses kept glancing at him like he didn't belong there, like they were waiting for him to explode. But he didn't. He held it all in. For Lauren. For the fight that was only just beginning. That's when he noticed the hospital's security guard watching him from across the room. The man whispered something into his radio, glanced back at Calvin, and started walking his way. "Sir," the guard said, trying to sound official, "I need you to come with me." Calvin didn't even move. "My daughter is in surgery. I'm not going anywhere." The guard shifted, clearing his throat. "We've received a call from Oak Ridge PD. You've been flagged as a potential threat to hospital staff. I'm going to have to ask you to step outside." A threat? Him? That's when Calvin knew. This wasn't just about Lauren anymore. They were coming after him. They were trying to paint him as unstable, dangerous, just like they had with every other black man they'd tried to silence. But this time, they picked the wrong one. Before Calvin could respond, a familiar voice cut through the tension. "Back off, now." Calvin turned to see a man in full military dress standing in the hallway, Colonel Sam Hollis, his old commanding officer, the man who had once led Calvin's Delta Force unit halfway around the world. The security guard froze. "This man has done more for this country than you'll ever know," Hollis growled, stepping between Calvin and the guard. "You want to start something? Go ahead. But you'll be dealing with the Pentagon before your shift ends." The guard backed off without another word. Calvin exhaled slowly, his fists finally relaxing. Hollis leaned in, his voice low. "They're already moving to cover this up. I've got lawyers being briefed as we speak. But Calvin, this isn't going to be easy." And he was right, because just outside those hospital walls, a press conference was already underway. Calvin watched from a television in the waiting room as Police Chief David Sutter stepped up to the microphone, wearing his perfectly pressed uniform and his perfectly fake expression of concern. With great sadness, Sutter began, "I must inform the public that one of our officers was forced to defend themselves last night when a female suspect made a threatening move toward what appeared to be a weapon." Calvin felt his jaw clench so hard his teeth hurt. "The lies just kept coming," Sutter continued, painting Lauren as some kind of aggressor, a threat. Not once did he mention her name. Not once did he acknowledge that she was a child someone's daughter. Calvin's daughter. His phone buzzed. It was a news alert. He opened it and felt like he'd been punched in the chest. There on the screen was a photo of Lauren. But it wasn't the photo they used at school. It wasn't the smiling, bright-eyed girl he saw every day. Number? It was a darkened, edited version of her school picture, cropped to make her look older, more dangerous, and right next to it, a stock image of a knife. They were trying to turn her into something she wasn't, a criminal, a threat. And worse, people were already believing it. Online comment sections filled with strangers calling her a thug, a gang member, people who didn't know her, people who didn't care. Calvin stared at the screen, his heart pounding, and then, just when he thought it couldn't get worse, it did. A hospital staff member approached him, holding a clipboard. "Mr. Price, we need you to sign this consent form for surgery." He reached for the pen, but the nurse pulled the clipboard back just slightly, her eyes flickering with fear. I'm sorry," she whispered, glancing around. "They're saying you might be violent. They told us to keep our distance." Calvin felt something snap inside him, not in anger, not in rage, but in heartbreak. His daughter was fighting for her life. He was fighting to hold it together. Ready, the walls were closing in. He stood there for a long moment, gripping the pen so hard it almost snapped in half. "I'm not leaving," he said quietly, "and I'm not the threat here." The nurse didn't respond. She just nodded and walked away. Calvin knew what was happening. They were building a case, not against the men who shot his daughter, but against him. They wanted to make him look unstable, dangerous, unhinged. So, when the truth finally came out, no one would believe him. But they underestimated something. You see, Calvin Price wasn't alone, and the next move, it was going to be his. Because they didn't just attack a teenage girl on the side of the road, they attacked the wrong family, and the fight was only just beginning. You ever notice how fast people switch sides when the system starts spinning the story? How quick the world turns its back the second you're labeled the problem. That's exactly what started happening to Calvin Price. The man who had once worn the uniform, fought for the flag, and served with honor, was now being painted as a ticking time bomb, a so-called dangerous veteran with anger issues. And the people doing the painting? The very ones who shot his little girl. Within 24 hours of that press conference, Calvin's face started showing up everywhere. The evening news, social media, talk radio, all with same script. Calvin Price, retired military, mental instability, possible PTSD. The word unstable came up so many times, it felt like they were trying to hypnotize the public into believing it. But the worst blow, the one that really knocked the wind out of him, it came from the people in his own neighborhood. Oak Ridge, a place he had chosen for Lauren, for her future. The nice houses, the good schools, the so-called safe streets. But he had always felt the whispers, the tight smiles, the way folks crossed to the other side of the street when he jogged through the neighborhood. He'd felt it when he first moved in, and old Mr. Jenkins kindly suggested he might be more comfortable in another part of town. He'd felt it when his neighbor, Karen Donaldson, called security the day he carried his gym equipment into his garage. She'd claimed she didn't recognize him, and now, the same people who had once nodded politely at him from their porches were posting online about how they always knew something was off about that Price family. It didn't matter that Calvin had medals of honor. It didn't matter that Lauren had straight A's and sang in the church choir. The minute the narrative turned, they turned right with it. Even the people he thought were friends. The guy from the hardware store who used to shake his hand every Saturday? Suddenly avoiding eye contact. The pastor from their church? Issuing a statement about praying for all sides involved. All sides? Calvin wanted to scream. There weren't two sides. There was the truth, and there was the cover-up. But nobody seemed to care about the truth. The final straw came when Calvin received a letter in the mail. A letter from the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association. It read like some legal nonsense, but the message was clear as day. His presence in the neighborhood was causing tension. Maybe it was best, they suggested, if he considered relocating. Relocating? They were telling him to pack up and leave, while his daughter was fighting for her life in a hospital bed. That night, Calvin sat alone in his living room, staring at the wall. His military plaques were still hanging there, proof of a lifetime of service. But they felt like they belonged to someone else now. Someone naive enough to believe that wearing the flag on your shoulder meant you'd be treated with respect back home. He barely noticed the knock on his door. When he finally stood to answer it, he found Colonel Hollis standing there again, holding a manila folder. "They're moving fast," Hollis said, walking inside without waiting for an invitation. "And they're getting dirty." He dropped the folder on the coffee table. Calvin opened it and felt the blood drain from his face. It was a printed screenshot of a breaking news headline: "Former Delta commander accused of excessive force during deployment, disciplinary record surface." Calvin's jaw tightened. "That's a lie." "I know," Hollis replied. "But they're planting seeds. They're leaking fake military records to make you look like a man with a history of violence." Calvin slammed the folder shut. "Why? Why go this far?" Hollis leaned in, lowering his voice. "Because you're a threat to them now. You know too much. And if they can turn the public against you before you open your mouth, they win." Calvin rubbed his hands over his face, trying to process. "What about the body cam footage? What about the witnesses?" Hollis shook his head. "They're already saying the body cams malfunctioned. And as for witnesses, I've heard rumors folks are being visited by plainclothes officers, told they must have remembered it wrong." Calvin sat back, feeling like the walls were closing in. "How do we fight this?" he whispered. Hollis didn't answer right away. He just pulled a business card from his pocket and slid it across the table. "You call him," Hollis said. "Xavier Green, FBI. He owes me a favor." Calvin stared at the card. He knew Xavier by reputation, a former Delta teammate turned federal agent, someone who played by his own rules, someone who didn't scare easy. "Tell him everything," Hollis continued. "And Calvin, whatever you do, don't stop fighting, because if they bury you, they bury Lauren with you." Calvin nodded slowly, feeling that fire reignite in his chest. He wasn't done, not by a long shot. The next morning, he made the call, and what Xavier Green told him on the other end, it changed everything. Because Xavier had already been watching Oak Ridge. He'd already seen the patterns, the same cops, the same stories, the same families left shattered. And according to Xavier, Lauren wasn't the first, and if they didn't stop this, she wouldn't be the last. It started with a phone call, but what came next was a war. Calvin had heard a lot about Xavier Green over the years. Back when they served together, Xavier had always been the one who saw the bigger picture, the one who never trusted surface-level reports. He didn't just follow orders, he questioned them, sometimes too much. That's probably why he left Delta and ended up at the Bureau. But one thing was for sure, if anyone knew how to dig beneath the lies, it was Xavier. Calvin didn't waste time. He laid it all out: what happened to Lauren, the fake news reports, the missing body cam footage, the way the system was closing in on him. He told Xavier everything. Xavier didn't interrupt once. He just listened. And when Calvin finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Calvin," Xavier finally said, his voice steady, "you're not imagining this. You're in the middle of something bigger than you think." Calvin leaned forward, gripping the phone tighter. "What do you mean?" "I've been quietly watching Oak Ridge for months," Xavier explained. "Internal complaints, mysterious cover-ups, traffic stops that never add up. I knew something was dirty, but I couldn't pin it down. Until now." Calvin's heart pounded in his chest. "You think this is organized?" "I don't think," Xavier replied. "I know." That's when Xavier told him about the Clean Lanier stretch of highway running right through Oak Ridge. What looked like a simple suburban neighborhood was actually sitting on top of one of the biggest drug trafficking routes on the East Coast. And the worst part? The cops in Oak Ridge weren't just turning a blind eye. They were protecting it. "Think about it," Xavier continued. "They stage fake traffic stops. They pull over innocent drivers, mostly Minoritisto, make it look like they're keeping the streets safe. But the real game? It's the shipments they let slide through. Trucks, vans, Cars moving product right under everyone's nose. Calvin felt his stomach turn. And Lauren? She just got caught in the middle? I'm not so sure it was random, Xavier said darkly. Your name's been on their radar for years. Your military background. Your reputation. You've asked too many questions in the past, Calvin. You were already a threat. Your daughter just gave them an opportunity. It hit Calvin like a freight train. They hadn't just shot Lauren by accident. They'd used her to send a message. Xavier didn't stop there. He started naming names. Officer Brandon Moss, Officer Jake Harrow, both involved in multiple complaints of racial profiling, excessive force, and mysteriously lost body cam footage. Every single complaint had vanished from their records. And then there was Police Chief David Sutter, the same man standing on television talking about department protocols. Turns out, Sutter's name was all over some questionable financial transactions, campaign donations, private investments, all tied to shell companies with connections to known drug traffickers. But that wasn't even the worst of it. According to Xavier, the rot went all the way up to Attorney General Wesley Burke, the top law enforcement official in the state. The man who was supposed to oversee police accountability. Burke had been receiving payments, big ones, through offshore accounts. The same accounts used by the very cartel moving drugs through Oak Ridge. The same cartel Calvin's team had gone after overseas years ago. It all clicked into place. The cartel hadn't just survived. They'd infiltrated the system. Calvin felt the weight of it all settle on his shoulders. He knew what they were up against now. This wasn't just about a couple of dirty cops. This was a network, a machine, and it had been running for years. That's when Xavier asked the question Calvin already knew was coming. Who do you trust? Calvin closed his eyes. He knew who. There were men out there, men he had bled, with who'd answer the call without hesitation. So he made the calls. First was Tony Brick Wallace, his old demolitions expert. Calvin knew Tony had been running a private security firm out of Atlanta. The second Tony heard what happened to Lauren, he didn't even blink. I'll be there by nightfall, he said. Next was Miguel Soto, the tech wizard of their old unit. Miguel had disappeared into the corporate tech world after leaving Delta, but Calvin knew he still had the skills to dig into systems most people didn't even know existed. Miguel didn't ask questions. He just said, "Tell me where to meet." By sundown, they were all in the same room. Xavier, Tony, Miguel, and Calvin. It felt like coming home, but the mission this time was personal. Tony paced the room, cracking his knuckles. You telling me these clowns shot Lauren to send a message to you? Calvin nodded. That's exactly what they did. Miguel shook his head. And now they're running cover all the way to the Attorney General's office? Damn. Xavier leaned forward, spreading out printouts of financial records and traffic stop data. This is bigger than any of us expected. But it's tight. These guys have money, power, and political protection. So what's the play? Tony asked. Calvin stood up, staring at the map of Oak Ridge spread across the table. We expose them, every last one of them, and we protect Lauren while we do it. Miguel nodded. I can get into their servers. They think wiping body cams is enough? They're wrong. Every cruiser backs up its footage to a central server. They don't even know it. Xavier pulled out a burner phone. I've got contacts, unofficial of course, but they can help us trace the money. And Tony? He just smiled. Let me worry about keeping us breathing. They had a plan, they had a team, but most importantly, they had nothing left to lose. As the night stretched on, they worked in silence, piecing together a strategy. They knew the risks. They knew the system would come after them harder than ever. But this time, Calvin wasn't going to play defense. This time, he was taking the fight straight to their front door. Because they didn't just mess with a veteran. They didn't just shoot an innocent girl. They picked the wrong family. And they were about to find out exactly what that meant. There's something nobody tells you about war. It doesn't end when the shooting stops. The real battles, the ones that keep you awake at night, those happen in the quiet. In the places you least expect, like hospital rooms. Calvin Price had spent most of his life in combat zones, but nothing compared to the cold, sterile silence of that ICU hallway. Lauren had survived the surgery. The doctors had done everything they could, but the damage was done. Calvin sat beside her bed, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest. Tubes, wires, machines beeping quietly. She looked so small, so fragile. It broke him in ways he couldn't explain. He reached for her hand, brushing his thumb across her skin. "Daddy's here, baby girl," he whispered. "You're safe now." But deep down, he knew she wasn't. The threats hadn't stopped. They were just getting more clever. That morning, Miguel had intercepted something on the police dispatch channel. A quiet little memo. A request for patient transfer authorization filed by Oak Ridge PD. They were planning to move Lauren, claiming it was for her safety. But Calvin knew better. They wanted her out of reach, off the grid. Somewhere they could control the narrative, maybe even silence her for good. He had less time than he thought. Calvin leaned in close to Lauren. "I'm getting you out of here," he promised. "Tonight." He stood to leave the room when something caught his eye. A nurse entering with a syringe. She checked the chart, nodded at Calvin, and walked toward Lauren's the fourth. "What's that?" Calvin asked, already on edge. "Pain management," the nurse replied softly. Calvin took a step closer. "Let me see the chart." The nurse froze. "Sir, I need you to—" Calvin didn't wait. He snatched the chart from her hands and scanned it. And that's when his blood ran cold. Codeine. Lauren was allergic to codeine. It was marked in bold, right there on her medical record. Calvin's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "She's allergic to this." "Who ordered it?" The nurse stammered, backing away. I just follow orders, sir." Calvin's fists clenched, fighting every instinct to grab her right then and there. But he knew this woman was just the delivery. Someone else had given that order. Someone trying to finish what those cops had started. He took the syringe, snapped it in half, and threw it in the trash. He leaned down to Lauren again, whispering, "We're leaving tonight. No more waiting." Calvin stepped out into the hallway, pulled out his phone, and called Tony. "It's time," he said. Tony didn't ask questions. "We're already set." Hours later, after the hospital had gone quiet, Calvin and his team made their move. Miguel had disabled several of the building's security cameras using a remote signal blocker. Tony posed as an off-duty paramedic, complete with a stolen uniform and ambulance parked in the service bay. Calvin walked into Lauren's room one last time, gently pulling the wires from her arms. She stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "Dad! What's going on?" Calvin leaned in, smiling softly. "We're going home, baby." She tried to sit up but winced. "Am I in trouble?" "No," he whispered, lifting her into his arms. "But the people who did this to you, they're about to be." They made it down to the loading dock without incident. Calvin placed Lauren on a stretcher, covering her face with a surgical mask to keep her hidden. Tony gave him a nod as they wheeled her into the ambulance and shut the doors. Calvin climbed in beside her, holding her hand the entire way. Miguel followed in a separate vehicle, monitoring police chatter to make sure they weren't being followed. The plan worked for the first hour. But nothing ever goes smoothly in a war like this. Miguel's voice crackled over the radio. "We've got movement. 2 squad cars, unmarked, heading east on Lincoln. They're looking for you." Tony floored the gas pedal, cutting down a back road toward a remote safe house on the edge of Chesapeake, an old cabin owned by one of Calvin's military buddies. They arrived just before sunrise. The cabin wasn't much, but it had what they needed: privacy, security, and a military medic on standby. Dr. Natalie Rivera had served with Calvin in the past. She wasn't officially practicing anymore, but she had enough supplies and skill to keep Lauren stable until they figured out their next move. As the sun rose over the tree line, Calvin sat by Lauren's side once again. She was awake now, groggy, aware. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Why are they doing this?" Calvin swallowed hard. He didn't want to tell her. Not yet. But she deserved the truth. "They're scared of what you saw," he explained. "They're scared of who you are." She blinked slowly, her voice trembling. "Because I'm your daughter?" Calvin nodded, tears threatening to break free. "Yeah, baby. Because you're my daughter." She gripped his hand tighter. "I don't want to hide, Dad. I want to fight." He leaned down, pressing his forehead to hers. "We will. I promise." But as they sat there in that quiet cabin, far away from the cameras, the police lights, and the lies, Calvin knew the truth. This wasn't over. Not even close. Because the people who shot his daughter hadn't just made a mistake. They'd declared war on the wrong family. And Calvin Price? He was just getting started. When you've seen the worst humanity has to offer, you start to recognize the smell of a lie before you even hear it. And right now, Calvin Price could smell it everywhere. The news, the police statements, the social media spin it was all part of the same machine. A system designed to protect itself, not the people it claimed to serve. And every minute they controlled the story, the truth about Lauren's shooting slipped further and further away. But Calvin and his team, they weren't just watching, they were working. And Miguel Soto? He had just cracked the first real crack in their armor. Sitting in that dusty cabin, surrounded by laptops and cables, Miguel leaned back with a grin on his face that Calvin hadn't seen in years. "I've got something," Miguel announced. Calvin leaned in. "What is it?" Miguel turned the laptop toward him, showing a live stream of data pulling from a secured server Oak Ridge PD's central video storage system. "They wiped the body cams like we figured," Miguel explained. "But every cruiser in the fleet? It's programmed to auto-back up its footage wirelessly to this server. Looks like they forgot that part." Calvin's heart raced. "You got the footage?" Miguel nodded. "Not just any footage, all of it." They sat there for hours, scrubbing through file after file, until they found it the unedited footage of the night Lauren was shot. Calvin watched, fists clenched, as Officer Brandon Moss approached Lauren's car. He could hear Lauren's voice, clear as day, respectful and calm. "Yes, sir." "My hands are on the wheel. You know why I stopped you?" Moss asked, his tone already aggressive. "No, sir," Lauren replied softly. "Your taillight's out." Calvin's jaw tightened. He knew that was a lie. Lauren's car had been inspected just a week earlier. Lauren stayed calm. "I wasn't aware, sir. I can get that fixed." Moss shifted his weight, hand hovering near his gun. "Step out of the vehicle." "May I ask why, sir?" Calvin could hear the fear in Lauren's voice now. But she kept her hands visible. She did everything right. "I'm just going to call my dad," she said, slowly reaching toward the passenger seat where her phone sat. "Don't reach for anything," Moss barked. "I'm just calling my dad." 3 gunshots rang out, one after the other. Calvin flinched like he'd been shot himself. He watched as Lauren's body slumped against the seat. But it wasn't just the shooting that tore him apart. It was what came next. A second officer ran up. "What the hell did you do?" he yelled. Moss didn't even flinch. "Check her ID." The second officer dug through Lauren's purse, pulled out her license, and froze. "Jesus Christ, it's Price's kid, Delta Force Price." Calvin felt like his heart had stopped. Moss leaned in, his voice shaking. "We need to make this go away. Call the chief. Now." Miguel paused the video. The room went silent. Tony let out a low whistle. "Well, there it is." Calvin sat back, his chest tight. He had just watched his worst nightmare play out again. This time from the other side of the camera. But now they had proof. Real, undeniable proof. The next step was getting that proof out. That's where Xavier came in. He had a contact, an independent journalist named Sean Patel. Someone who didn't answer to corporate media or local politics. Someone who wasn't afraid to burn the whole system down if it meant telling the truth. They met Sean at a rundown diner on the edge of town. Calvin didn't trust many people these days, but Xavier vouched for him. And after seeing the footage, Sean didn't hesitate. "This is big," Sean whispered, glancing around. "Bigger than anything I've worked on." "Good," Calvin replied. "Because I need the whole country to see it." Sean nodded. "Consider it done." And just like that, the truth was loose. By sunrise, the video had gone viral. A number just as for Lauren started trending across social media. Millions of people watched as Lauren, a 17-year-old girl, did everything right and still got shot. Public outrage exploded. Protesters flooded the streets of Oak Ridge. National media finally started paying attention. No more darkened photos, no more fake headlines, just the raw, undeniable truth. But while the country watched the footage on their phones and television screens, the people running the system, they didn't blink. Police Chief Sutter held another press conference that afternoon. This time, his mask of concern was even thinner. "We're aware of the video circulating online," he said coldly. "While unfortunate, the footage does not change the fact that our officers feared for their lives. Our internal investigation remains ongoing." Calvin felt his blood boil. Internal investigation? That was code for bury it deeper. It didn't end there. A few hours later, Calvin's phone buzzed with another notification. His military record leaked again, this time with fake disciplinary actions, claims that he'd been discharged for mental instability, violence during missions, and reckless command decisions. It was all a lie. But the headlines didn't care. The news with it like it was gospel. And just like that, the public started to split. Some believed the truth. Others swallowed the lies. Calvin knew the game. They were trying to divide the narrative, turn this into just another controversy people would argue about for a few days before moving on. But this wasn't going to fade. Not this time. Not while Lauren was still lying in a bed, fighting to move her legs again. Not while the people who did this walked free. And definitely not while Calvin Price still had breath in his lungs. The question wasn't if he'd fight back. The question was how far he'd go. And the answer? As far as it takes. The thing about power is it never goes down without throwing one last punch. And when it does, it doesn't come straight at you. It comes sideways, sneaky, dirty. And that's exactly what was about to happen to Calvin Price. After the footage went viral, Calvin expected the system to hit back. What he didn't expect was how fast they'd turn the entire weight of it on him. It started with a knock on his motel door just after midnight. Tony opened it first, his hand resting on the concealed weapon at his side. But it wasn't a threat standing there. It was Sergeant Karen Drummond. Calvin recognized her face instantly, one of the only officers in Oak Ridge who hadn't looked at him like a criminal from day one. She'd been quiet through all of this. Too quiet. Until now. She stepped inside, looking over her shoulder like she was being followed. "I don't have much time," she whispered. "They're setting you up." Calvin stood, his stomach tightening. "What do you mean?" "Setting me up? They're going to pin a murder on you," she said. "One of the officers, Brandon Moss. They're planning to take him out and leave evidence pointing straight to you. They already have your name on the arrest warrant. It's already written up. All they're waiting for is the body." Tony let out a low whistle. "Of course they are." Calvin's fists clenched at his sides. He could feel it, the pressure, the noose tightening. "Why are you telling me this?" Calvin asked carefully. Karen swallowed hard. "Because I've seen enough. Because you're right about all of it. But once they put this on you, it's over. Nobody will care about the video. Nobody will care about Lauren. You'll just be another angry veteran who snapped. That's the headline they're writing as we speak." Calvin rubbed his hands over his face. It was too perfect, too clean. If they pulled this off, the public would turn on him in a heartbeat. "When's it happening?" he asked. "Tonight," Karen replied. "I don't know where or when exactly, but it's happening soon." Calvin nodded, jaw tight. "Thank you." Karen nodded back. "I'm risking everything just being here. Be careful." She slipped out the door, and Tony locked it behind her. Miguel stood by the window, arms crossed. "We can't outrun this, man. We need to hit back before they set the hook." Calvin nodded slowly. "We don't wait for the body to drop. We catch them in the act." Tony cracked his knuckles. "Let's go fishing." It didn't take long to figure out where Brandon Moss would be that night. Miguel tapped into Oak Ridge PD's internal system again. Found a patrol route. Found the address. Moss was off duty, but he had a habit 3 beers on his back deck every night around 11. Sloppy, predictable, and vulnerable. It wasn't a lot to go on, but it was all they had. So Calvin went alone. No cameras, no team, no weapons, just him, and a small audio recorder in his jacket pocket. He found Moss exactly where Miguel said he'd be, sitting on his back porch, cleaning his service weapon like it was just another Tuesday night. Calvin stepped out of the shadows, quiet, controlled. Moss nearly dropped his gun. "Jesus!" Moss stammered, standing up. "How the hell did you—" Calvin cut him off. "Sit down." Moss reached for his holster, but Calvin shook his head slowly. "You pull that, I'll take it, and then we'll both see how fast this ends." Moss froze, hands raised just enough to show he wasn't stupid. Calvin stepped closer, keeping his voice low and steady. "I know what you did to my daughter, and I know you're planning to frame me next. So here's how this goes. You tell me the truth, right here, right now." Moss let out a shaky breath, looking around like someone might save him. But there was no one, just the two of them. "You don't understand," Moss muttered. "Then make me understand." Calvin shot back. Moss sank back into his chair, running his hands over his face. "It wasn't supposed to go that far." "Camden!" Camden said to scare her. To send a message. "That's all." Calvin's fists clenched. "You shot a child." Moss swallowed hard. "I didn't know she was yours." "Not at first." But when we found her ID, Camden lost it. He said it was perfect, said we could use it to shut you down before you started digging again. Calvin leaned in. And now you're the loose end. Moss nodded slowly, his voice cracking. They're gonna kill me tonight. Make it look like you did it. They already planted evidence. You're already guilty. Calvin felt the weight of it settle in his chest. It was already done. The machine was already rolling. He stood slowly. You can stop it. Go public. Tell the truth. Moss let out a bitter laugh. You don't get it. Even if I do, I'm dead either way. Calvin turned to leave, but paused at the door. Then you'd better make it count. He slipped back into the shadows, heart pounding. He had the recording. He had the confession. It wasn't much, but it was something. He made it halfway back to the motel when Miguel's voice crackled through the radio. Turn on the news. Calvin pulled over, grabbed his phone, and opened the live stream. The headline hit him like a brick. Breaking. Oak Ridge officer found dead suspect Calvin Price, wanted for murder. His breath caught in his throat. He watched in disbelief as the reporter read the script. Thou police had found Moss dead in his home, shot with his own weapon. How they had overwhelming evidence linking Calvin to the crime, including fingerprints on the gun and materials tying him to extremist groups. It was already happening. Miguel's voice came through again, urgent. They planted a storage unit in your name, full of fake evidence. They're going all in, man. Tony's voice joined in. We gotta move. Now. Calvin sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. They had him. They finally had him. And the only thing standing between him and the rest of his life behind bars was a truth no one wanted to hear. But if they thought this was the end, they didn't know Calvin Price. Not even close. Because this wasn't a man running from justice. This was a father running toward it, and he was about to take the whole damn system with him. The thing about being hunted is that after a while, you stop running, you stop hiding, you stop worrying about what people say, what they think, what they believe, because none of it matters anymore. Not when they've already decided who you are, not when they've already built the cage. Calvin Price knew that better than anyone. He wasn't the man they said he was on television. He wasn't a killer. He wasn't unhinged. He wasn't the monster they made him out to be. But none of that mattered now, because when you're painted as public enemy number one, you stop playing defense, and you start preparing for the final move. Calvin stood in the middle of the motel room, staring at the faces of the people who had stuck by him when everyone else had walked away. Tony, Miguel, Xavier, and Sarah. His team, his family. They knew the stakes, they knew the risks, and they were still here. We can't run anymore, Calvin said quietly. They've got every exit blocked, every news station running their story. They've already put me in the ground. I just haven't fallen yet. Tony leaned forward. So what's the play? Calvin took a deep breath. We take this straight to the people. One shot, one move. Public, loud. Where they can't twist it. Where they can't bury it. Sarah nodded. I've got contacts in the city, independent media, activists, people who still care about the truth. Miguel spun his laptop around. And I've got every dirty file they thought they deleted. Financial records, backup footage, emails, text messages. I can push it all, but we'll only get one chance before they shut it down. Xavier crossed his arms. If you go public, they'll move on you, fast. I'm counting on it, Calvin replied. We draw them out. We make them show their hand. Tony cracked his knuckles. When? Calvin didn't hesitate. Tonight. The plan was simple. Risky, but simple. They would organize a peaceful demonstration right in front of Oak Ridge Police Headquarters, right in front of the cameras, right in front of the country. Calvin would show up unarmed, unafraid, and put the truth out there before the system could spin it again. It was suicide on paper, but it was the only move left. Sarah worked the phones. Miguel prepped the data dump. Xavier coordinated off the record with a handful of honest cops still willing to stand for something. Tony made sure every exit route was mapped. By sundown, the crowd had started to gather. Hundreds at first, then thousands. People holding signs, people chanting Lauren's name, people who had seen the video and refused to believe the lies. And right there in the middle of it all stood Calvin Price. No mask, no fear, just a father and a fighter. The cameras rolled as he stepped up to the mic. "My name is Calvin Price," he began, his voice steady, carrying over the sea of people. "I served this country for over 20 years. I fought for freedom, for justice, for every person who ever believed that America stood for something bigger than fear." He paused, looking out at the crowd. "And I'm standing here tonight, not as a soldier, but as a father." The crowd fell silent. "My daughter was shot 3 times by the people who swore to protect her. She did nothing wrong. She followed every rule, and they still tried to kill her. Then they tried to kill the truth. And when they couldn't do that, they came after me." He pointed toward the building behind him. "They say I'm a killer, a fugitive, a threat. But I'm here in the open, unarmed, and I'm telling you, they are the threat. Not me, not my daughter, not the families they've silenced for years." Miguel hit the upload button. In seconds, thousands of files began flooding the internet. Leaked footage, corrupt financial records, internal memos, evidence that went all the way up to the Attorney General's office. And just like that, the truth was out. The crowd erupted. But the response from inside that building? It was exactly what Calvin expected. Police in riot gear poured onto the steps, shields, batons, tear gas canisters at the ready. And leading them? Police Chief David Sutter, the man who started it all. Sutter raised a bullhorn. His voice cut through the noise like a blade. "Calvin Price, you are under arrest for inciting violence, disturbing the peace, and the murder of Officer Brandon Moss." Calvin stood his ground. "I haven't touched a soul," Sutter smiled coldly. "Not what the body cams will show." Tony moved to Calvin's side. "We've got an exit." Calvin shook his head. "Number, we finish this here." Sutter signaled the officers to move in. The crowd pushed back, locking arms, chanting louder, but the police closed in fast, shoving people aside, clearing a path straight to Calvin. Xavier appeared out of nowhere, whispering urgently, "Don't resist. We've got people watching. Cameras rolling. They can't spin it if you go peacefully." Calvin nodded once. He raised his hands. The officers grabbed him, yanking his arms behind his back, cuffing him tighter than necessary. Sutter leaned in, speaking just low enough for Calvin to hear. "You should have taken the hint, Commander. Now you'll lose everything." Calvin met his eyes. Not everything. They shoved him toward a waiting police van. But when they rounded the corner, something unexpected happened. The van wasn't marked, and the officers weren't Oak Ridge PD. Calvin tensed, ready to fight, but the driver turned around, pulling off his helmet. It was Officer Rodriguez, the same state trooper who had quietly helped them before. "Easy, Commander," Rodriguez whispered. "I'm on your side." Calvin narrowed his eyes. "Prove it." Rodriguez reached into his vest and pulled out a small recorder. "I've been gathering evidence. Your speech tonight? It didn't just reach the public. It reached the state police. We've been watching Sutter for months. You just blew the lid off this whole thing." Calvin's heart skipped. "Where's Lauren?" he asked, panic flashing in his chest. "She's safe," Rodriguez promised. "We've had eyes on the facility, but if you want to get her out for good, you're gonna need backup." Rodriguez handed Calvin a burner phone. "One contact, one number. When you're ready," Rodriguez said, "we'll be waiting." The van pulled away from the chaos. And for the first time, Calvin Price didn't feel like a man on the run. He felt like a man with a second chance, and he wasn't about to waste it. It's one thing to say you'll fight for your family. It's another to stand at the edge of the line and actually cross it. Calvin Price had crossed that line, and there was no turning back. He'd spent his entire life being careful, following rules, playing by the book. But now, the book had been burned, the rules were broken, and all that was left was getting his daughter back. The minute Officer Rodriguez handed him that phone, Calvin knew what he had to do. The contact on that phone wasn't just anyone. It was someone higher than Sutter, someone who could actually make a difference. But calling that number meant committing to something bigger. It meant trusting someone outside his circle. And after everything he'd been through, trust didn't come easy. Still, he had no choice. He made the call. A voice on the other end answered with a single word. "Ready." Calvin didn't ask who. He didn't ask why. He just told them the truth. "My daughter's being held at Camden's hunting lodge," he said. "I'm going in tonight. I need the area cleared afterward." There was a long pause. Then the voice replied, "Consider it done." Calvin hung up and turned to his team. Tony, Miguel, Xavier, Sarah still standing with him, ready to follow him into the fire. "We move in 2 hours," Calvin said. "Get ready." The lodge sat on 20 acres of private land, surrounded by thick trees and armed guards. It was built like a fortress. But Calvin wasn't interested in storming the place like some Hollywood movie. He was smarter than that. Miguel had already hacked the security grid. Tony had mapped the guard shifts. Xavier had tracked the backup routes. And Sarah. She was live streaming the entire plan to an encrypted server. Just in case things went south, Calvin's heart raced as they approached the outer perimeter. He could see the lodge glowing in the distance, lights on every window, shadows moving inside. They had Lauren. He could feel it. Miguel's voice crackled softly in his earpiece. "Security cameras going down now." The outer lights flickered, one by one, giving Calvin and Tony the cover they needed to move in. They slipped through the trees, moving like shadows. Delta Force training never left you. It lived in your bones. They reached the back of the lodge, crouched beneath a row of windows. Calvin peered inside, and there she was, Lauren, lying in a hospital bed, connected to an IV, her eyes half closed, drugged but awake. Calvin's jaw tightened. He could feel the rage building in his chest, but he pushed it down. Rage wouldn't save her. Precision would. Tony moved to the door, disabling the lock in seconds. They slipped inside. Lauren stirred, blinking slowly as Calvin leaned over her. "Dad?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Calvin pressed his finger to his lips. "Shh. I'm here, baby. We're getting you out." He gently removed the IV, wrapping her in a blanket. She tried to stand but wobbled. Calvin caught her, lifting her into his arms like she weighed nothing. They started toward the door, but they didn't make it far. Standing in the hallway was Chief Sutter, flanked by 2 armed guards. Sutter smiled that same cold, crooked smile. Well, well, looks like you just walked into your own grave, Commander." Calvin set Lauren down gently, stepping in front of her. "Let her go. This ends tonight." Sutter laughed. "You're right, it does. But not the way you think." He raised his weapon. But before Sutter could pull the trigger, Miguel's voice crackled through the comms. "We're live." Calvin smiled, because what Sutter didn't know was that every word he'd said since they entered the building had been streaming live to the public. Sarah had pushed the feed to every social media platform, every independent news outlet, every activist channel in the country. The whole world was watching. Calvin stepped forward. "Go ahead, say it again. Tell them how you planned this from the start, how you used my daughter to silence me. Go on." The cameras are rolling. Sutter's face turned pale. He glanced toward the security cameras and finally realized the trap. Red and blue lights suddenly flashed outside the windows. State Police, led by Officer Rodriguez. Sutter panicked, grabbing Lauren by the arm. "Nobody moves!" But Calvin moved first. With a single, fluid motion, he disarmed Sutter, twisting the gun from his hand and pinning him against the wall. The 2 guards raised their weapons, but Rodriguez's team burst through the door, forcing them to the ground. It was over. Really over. Rodriguez cuffed Sutter himself, reading him his rights loud enough for everyone to hear. Calvin turned back to Lauren, scooping her into his arms as she clung to him, sobbing. "You're safe now, baby girl," he whispered. "It's over." But deep down, Calvin knew it wasn't really over, because the arrest was just the beginning. The real fight? That was still waiting in court. But for the first time, they had a fighting chance. And this time, Calvin wasn't going to let them bury the truth. Not now. Not ever. It's funny how quick the world can change when the truth finally sees daylight. One minute, you're the villain on every screen in America. The next, you're the man who cracked the whole thing wide open. After the takedown at the hunting lodge, Calvin Price didn't run. He didn't hide. He walked right into the federal courthouse with his daughter at his side and dared them to try and spin the story one more time. But this time, they couldn't, because Sarah had released every piece of evidence Miguel pulled from the police: service mails, bank records, camera footage, even audio recordings of Chief Sutter giving the kill order on Calvin's life. It was all public now, and there wasn't a politician or news anchor in the country brave enough to defend what had been exposed. The state police had Sutter in custody. But the bigger fish? The ones pulling the real strings? That fight was just getting started. Calvin sat in a private briefing room, staring across the table at Angela Diaz, the lead federal prosecutor assigned to the case. She laid out folders so thick they looked like phone books. "We have enough to indict the Attorney General of this state," she explained. "Wesley Burke's hands are all over this." Calvin leaned back, crossing his arms. "You really think you can bring him down?" Angela nodded. "We already have." She slid a document across the tableau. "Sealed indictment for Wesley Burke. Racketeering, conspiracy, abuse of power. 25 years, minimum." But Calvin knew better than to celebrate early. "What about Sutter? What about the cops who shot my daughter?" Angela didn't flinch. "We're bringing separate charges for them. Attempted murder, civil rights violations. It's going to trial." It sounded like everything Calvin had fought for. Justice, accountability. But in the back of his mind, something didn't sit right. It felt too clean. And sure enough, 2 days later, the system struck back. Angela called Calvin into her office with news that knocked the air right out of him. "They've produced a witness," she said quietly. "Someone from your past. Colonel Richard Blackwood." Calvin's stomach dropped. Blackwood, his former commanding officer, the man who had hated him for years after Calvin had reported him for risking the lives of their unit on a botched mission overseas. "He's claiming you fabricated evidence in the past," Angela explained. "That you manipulated reports. That you're unstable." Calvin stood, fists clenched. "That's a lie, and you know it." Angela nodded. "I do, but the jury won't." Blackwood was respected, decorated. His word carries weight. The trap was set again. They couldn't touch the evidence, so they went after the man who exposed it. Calvin felt the walls closing in all over again. But then, just when it seemed like everything was falling apart, Xavier showed up with a card up his sleeve. "I've got him," Xavier said, eyes cold. "Blackwood. I traced his financials. He took a payment, 300 grand, from a shell account linked to Wesley Burke, 2 days before he agreed to testify." Calvin's heart raced. "Can you prove it?" Xavier smiled. "Better. I already did." Xavier had worn a wire during a private meeting with Blackwood. And on that recording, Blackwood admitted to taking the payment. Admitted that it was a setup. Angela played the recording in court the next day. Blackwood's face turned white as a sheet. By the end of the week, Blackwood had flipped. He turned on Burke, turned on Sutter, and confessed that the entire thing was coordinated from the top down. And just like that, the whole thing started to collapse. Burke was arrested. Sutter pleaded guilty. 15 other officials were named in the conspiracy. But the real moment, the one that no one would ever forget, came during the sentencing hearing. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, victims' families, activists, people who had marched in the streets demanding justice for Lauren. And then she stood. Lauren. She stood up, holding onto a cane, walking slowly but walking. A hush fell over the room as she made her way to the front. She looked straight at the judge, her voice clear and strong. "These men took away my ability to walk without pain. They took away my trust in the people who were supposed to protect me. But they didn't take my voice, and they didn't take my future." She paused, looking toward the defendants. "I ask that their punishment reflect not just what they did to me, but what they've done to every family who never got a chance to speak in this room." The judge nodded slowly, his voice heavy with emotion as he read the sentences aloud. Life in prison for David Sutter. 25 years for Wesley Burke. 20 years each for the officers who shot Lauren. Justice, real justice, had finally landed. Afterward, Calvin stood outside the courthouse, looking at his daughter standing strong beside him. She wasn't just a survivor. She wasn't just a victim. She was hope, and she was just getting started. 1 year later, it didn't even feel real. The streets of Oak Ridge were quieter now. The protests had died down. The headlines had shifted to some new scandal in some other city. Reporters stopped calling. The cameras stopped rolling. But for Calvin Price and his daughter Lauren, the fight never really ended. It just changed. Calvin stood by his truck, looking out over the old cemetery hill. He'd been coming here more often lately. Some days, he didn't even know why. Maybe just to remember where it all started. Or maybe to remind himself it wasn't over. Lauren walked up slowly beside him, her cane tapping softly against the gravel path. She wasn't fully healed, doctors said she might never be, but she was walking, stronger every day, and that was more than Calvin ever thought he'd see after that night. She held a small bouquet of white lilies in her hand, the same kind her mother used to love. She knelt down carefully in front of Elaine's headstone, brushing the dust off the engraved name. "Hey, Mom," she whispered softly. "We did it." Calvin swallowed hard, feeling that familiar tightness in his throat. He knelt beside her, resting his hand on her shoulder. "She'd be proud of you, baby," he said quietly. Lauren smiled through glassy eyes. "She'd be proud of us both." They sat there for a moment, the silence wrapping around them like a blanket. No media, no noise, just father and daughter, still standing. When they finally stood to leave, Calvin glanced down at his watch. "You ready?" Lauren nodded. "As I'll ever be." That afternoon, they stood on the steps of the old community center, the same building that had once held HOA meetings Calvin wasn't invited to. But today, those doors were wide open, and hanging above them was a brand new banner. The Price Foundation for Justice. It was official now. The settlement from their civil case against Oak Ridge PD wasn't just sitting in some bank account. It was working, funding legal team, providing protection for families targeted by police abuse, offering scholarships for kids who deserved better than what Lauren had been through. The place was packed. Community members, activists, veterans, lawyers, people who had once been strangers, now standing together for something bigger than themselves. And Lauren? She wasn't just the face of it, she was the heart. She stepped up to the podium, looking out over the crowd. "Some of you know my story," she began, her voice steady. "Some of you marched beside me. Some of you watched from a distance, hoping things would change. Well, today, change starts here." Calvin stood at the edge of the stage, pride swelling in his chest. Lauren continued. "The people who tried to take my voice didn't just fail, they lit a fire that's not going out anytime soon. Because every time we stand up, every time we fight back, we prove that justice isn't something you wait for, it's something you build." The crowd erupted in applause. Later that night, back at the house, the same house Calvin refused to leave no matter how many letters the HOA sent, Lauren sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through an email on her phone. She looked up, eyes wide. "Dad?" "I got in." Calvin leaned in. "Got in where?" She turned the phone toward him, smiling bigger than he'd seen in months. "Georgetown Law." Calvin felt his throat tighten again. "Your mother's dream." Lauren nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek. "I'm going to be a civil rights attorney, Dad. I'm going to finish what we started." Calvin pulled her into a hug, holding on like he never wanted to let go. And maybe, in a way, he never would. Because this wasn't just their fight anymore. It belonged to every family who had ever lost someone to a broken system. Every kid who had ever been told to keep their hands visible, to stay quiet, to survive another day. Every father who had ever knelt on a sidewalk, holding their child's blood in their hands, praying for just one more breath. Calvin knew they couldn't fix everything, but they could fight. And they weren't fighting alone anymore. As the night settled over Oak Ridge, Calvin stood on the porch, looking out over the street that had once felt like enemy territory. It didn't feel like that anymore. Not tonight. He knew the battle wasn't over. There would always be another Sutter, another Burke, another headline designed to divide and distract. But as long as there were people like Lauren, people willing to stand up and speak out, there was hope. Real hope. He took a deep breath, closing his eyes. The war had nearly broken him. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, Calvin Price felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. And this time, he wasn't letting go. Not now. Not ever. If there's one thing this story reminds us all, it's that the fight for justice doesn't stop with a headline. And it sure doesn't stop when the cameras turn off. It keeps going in the quiet, in the dark, in the places nobody's watching, and sometimes the fight comes to your front door. But here's the truth, friends. You are never powerless. Calvin Price didn't win because he had military training. He won because he refused to stay silent. He stood up when the system tried to shut him down. He reached out when others turned away. And he kept going, even when the odds were stacked against him. And Lauren? She's living proof that even when life tries to break you, you can rise again. You can take your pain and turn it into purpose. So if this story moved you, if it made you think about what really matters, do me a favor. Hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next story that shines a light on truth, justice, and the power of ordinary people standing up against extraordinary odds. And hey, share this video with someone who might need to hear it today. Because together, we keep the fight alive. Thank you for watching. God bless you, and I'll see you in the next one.